For each of us, we've discovered that coronavirus is something that has invaded and captivated our lives. I personally have had 12 different trips already canceled because of the virus. People have had all kinds of work stoppages, delays, canceled vacations, loss of investments. People have their children coming home from school. And we've just probably scratched the surface with all the disruptions that have come as a result of this virus. And so if you're like me, you're wondering, number one, what to make of all this, and number two, how should I respond to the crisis that is taking place? What's the level of concern I should be demonstrating? Should I just board up my windows and doors and stay inside, or should I be doing something? And I wanted just to give you just a couple of thoughts that just as I've been praying, and those of us at Blackaby Ministries have been considering and studying, some things that I think at least you need to put on the table to consider as you ponder what your response ought to be. One is just to be aware that these kinds of crises will come periodically. If you're as old as me, you can remember a number of other different epidemics and concerns and crises of various sorts. They all look somewhat different and unique. Some seem to be more contagious. They capture public's attention, perhaps a little more vehemently than others, but it seems that there's always something coming. And as Christians, we need to learn to study our history and be prepared and not be surprised or caught off guard when the next thing like this happens. Because even back into the early centuries in church history, there were crises taking place. In the 4th century, plague struck the city of Caesarea. Caesarea was a major city and one of the 4th or 5th largest in all the Roman Empire, when all of a sudden a plague swept through. And many people were dying, and panic ensued. Anyone who was able was trying to flee the city, get out into the country, escape this death that seemed to be lurking everywhere. People didn't know how to protect themselves. All they knew to do was to panic and to flee. But surprisingly, there was one group of people that didn't flee, that didn't panic, and those were the Christians. They actually stayed behind and ministered to the poor and to the hungry. They buried the dead. When people were bewildered and had no one to care for them, the Christians would be those that they could turn to and know that they could find help. Even later, Justinian, one of the last pagan Roman emperors, actually complained about the Christians. He said, everybody knows that when there's a crisis, you don't go to the pagan priests, you don't go to the pagan churches and temples, you go to the Christians because they'll help you. They keep their heads. They ended up as a Christian group, because of the crises and the way they handled it, going from a fringe group of movement in history to becoming the official religion in all of the Roman Empire. Many people would say the church grew most in times of crisis. When everybody was experiencing health and prosperity, people didn't necessarily feel that they needed God or needed the church. But sometimes it's the crisis that suddenly it's kind of like the refining fire. It exposes and reveals the authenticity of a movement or even of a Christian and a believer. And so we are now facing one of those times where there's widespread concern and fear, even panic at times. And in the midst of that, how should Christians respond in this situation? 3 things that I would just say. And of course, I think it goes without saying that you ought to be prudent. You ought to be careful. Wash your hands. Don't go into crowds right now if you don't need to, if there's not a purpose for that. And so can I just say, obviously, try to be careful and keep yourself protected as best you can. But are there some specific things Christians ought to be doing? First one I would say is watch to see what God is doing in the midst of this time. You see, God is always at work around you, and certainly He's at work now. In fact, if you're watching carefully, you'll discover that God's doing some things right now that perhaps you've not seen before. When everybody is going along perfectly fine, they don't necessarily want to talk to you about God or about life and death, about heaven and hell. But when all of a sudden they're facing the danger of perhaps catching a terminal, fatal illness, well, suddenly they may be open to some things that they weren't before. Perhaps there may be people that would not even engage in a discussion with you before. Or maybe there's people that are just fiercely independent and they don't want help from anybody. But now in this situation they're in, they find themselves in a place where they need to know that there's someone there that will look out for them and help them if they need it. You may have new opportunities in the time of this crisis that you didn't have before. And so keep your spiritual eyes and ears open for those conversations, for those encounters. When you see someone who's troubled and worried and anxious and fearful, when the Lord puts someone on your heart and mind and you think, I wonder if anybody is checking on them, maybe an elderly person, and now you can minister to them, a neighbor that you've never really talked to much before, but now you stop by to make sure they're okay. You'll have new opportunities if you watch for them, even in the midst of a very troubling time. Well, secondly, I would just say take advantage of your changed routines. A lot of things have shut down. A lot of things aren't possible to do right now. But don't focus on the negative. Assume that if this activity is shut down, then you've got time now to do something else. Last Sunday, the church services in the church I attend went online. You couldn't really go to the church building itself. And so my routine was changed. But I had to ask myself, I've got time on my hands. What should I do? One thing I did was drive over to my parents' house, help them get online so they could watch the church service as well, had breakfast with them, and spent some time with them. Normally they go to the 8 o'clock service on Sunday mornings, which is anathema to my wife and I. We don't do, we've never seen an 8 o'clock service that we cared for, and so we don't normally see my parents. But last Sunday we were able to do that. All of a sudden, I've personally had 12 trips canceled so far this spring. It's freed up all kinds of time in my schedule. Instead of just bemoaning the fact that I've lost a lot of ministry activities I was planning on doing, I've had to look and say, what do I do with this time? There's some Christian classics I may have time now to read. There's things I need to write and work on. There's things I want to study. There's all kinds of exercise routines, diets I can stick to better when I'm not on the road all the time. And all of a sudden, this free time for me is a gift if I'll look at it that way. Certainly, I miss some of the activities that I had planned on doing, but rather than focusing on that, I'd rather look at the new opportunities I have. And then finally, you just need to understand that every time there's a crisis, it's like doing a spiritual vital sign check. You see, when you have a heart issue, when the doctors want to test the strength of your heart, they don't wait till you're sound asleep in bed to test how your heart's doing. They put you on a they put you on a treadmill. They give you a stress test. They incline the treadmill. They make it go faster. They induce your stress upon you to find out how well your heart takes it. Well, oftentimes for the church, for the nation, for government, and for ourselves as Christians, stress, crises, help us to give a little bit of a test to ourselves to discover how strong is our faith, how relentless is our joy, how determined are we to trust in the Lord regardless of what happens. Sometimes you can see someone at church and everything seems fine with them, but as soon as there's an epidemic of flu or something more serious like coronavirus, they're filled with worry and dread. They become grumpy, and they've had a trip canceled that they planned on, and now they're upset and grumpy. No one wants to be around them. And you start to look and you say, well, is that all it took for them to lose their joy, to lose their faith, to lose their sense of peace? This is a great test, a great time, and certainly a great opportunity, a great apologetic for Christians to be able to demonstrate to others the difference that God makes in their life. A lot of people are having flights canceled, trips canceled, school shut down, jobs where people are laid off, investments that are plummeting. A lot of people are experiencing that, but they're not all handling it the same way. Some people, hopefully as Christians, still have their joy, still have their peace. Some people are becoming self-absorbed, and others are becoming others-focused and looking around saying, in the midst of this crisis, who could I help? Who should I be trying to look out for? This will be a time to expose a lot where you can demonstrate to a watching world the difference that Jesus makes in your life, but also you can examine yourself and say, am I handling this the way I ought to? Am I reflecting well on Jesus by the way I'm handling this particular crisis? So there's a lot going on right now, and certainly I don't want to minimize the discomfort and the challenges that you may be facing. But I do want you to know that when others see problems, Christians see possibilities. With every crisis, there's an opportunity for the church to advance, the kingdom of God to grow. And you don't want to miss that. God is always at work around you, and he's certainly at work around you right now. So regardless of how your life may have been changed and your schedule may be altered, keep your spiritual eyes and ears open, and you might be amazed at what you see God doing during these very difficult and confusing times.